That's a really nice background, Tim. Is it one of your own photographs?
No, I'm standing on the south bank of the Thames at the moment, Baroness. It's an early sunset.
Come on, own up.
No, I pinched it off the internet, but it's rather a nice photo, so I use it for my background. Otherwise, my background is my study, and I always get complaints about my curtains and things like that, so it's safer just to have a fake background.
Most people have books behind them, and it's very distracting because I find myself turning my head like this to try and read what it says on the spine.
Oh, there's terrible book envy that goes on with everybody with their bookcases. You can now get some fake bookcase back shops that have got the most ridiculous range of books on as well. So I'm not playing that game.
Well, my bookcase is there, so you can't see it. And there's a whole lot downstairs as well. So no books in my view.
Joan, just to warn you, we are being live streamed as from now. Right. So just be cautious with that, what anybody says before we formally start at 2 o'clock.
Okay.
Okay, so a couple of minutes to go. Sarah Jane, have we got everybody?
So I think we're still waiting for Sylvie from Leap, one of our parents.
Right.
So she shouldn't be too long. Catherine, are you in touch with Sylvie?
Yes, I'll just get in touch with her to check that she's okay.
Thank you.
Can I just check, can everybody hear me okay? Fine. At some stage I turn into a Dalek, but hopefully not for long on the sound on this.
Hello, Tim, it's nice to see you.
Hello. Right, people appearing. Hi, Hannah, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Now, you have got books behind you. We're just talking about bookcases as backdrops.
I have. These are genuine. They're travel books mainly.
Right. Good. So, Jane, do we have the minister, do we think? And do we have the shadow minister?
We do.
Vicky, hello. Well,
coming out of my head. Maybe I should move slightly down the table and then you won't have so much. Welcome to the Department for Education.
I think I recognise that plant because I think you've got my old office and I had a rather dodgy plant like that 8 years ago. So it's kept alive somehow.
I water it. We've got an awful lot of mouse traps in the Department for Education at the moment.
Probably we shouldn't reveal that too much. Right. We've got 1 minute to go and then we'll start formally, yeah?
Tim, can I ask you a question? Hello? Oops. Tim?
Hello, Baroness Massey.
It is. Hello, how are you, Tim? Good to see you.
We're fine. We can see a grey square. We can't see you.
Okay, well, I think I've got a problem in that it says you are viewing Celeste Pergolitz's NCB screen.
Right. Well, you work on that, but we've got, you can hear what we're doing anyway, so it's an important thing. Okay. I think we can probably get going because we've got a lot to get in. Have I got the go ahead to start? And everybody appears magically on my screen. Fantastic.
Sorted.
Right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tim Lawton. I'm the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Children, which is one of the largest groups in Parliament, which has an overview of everything to do with children and young people. And this is a first for us. This is the first virtual meeting we've had. We usually meet in one of the committee rooms of the House of Commons. So what could go wrong? We've got lots of fantastic speakers. We've got videos. We've got lots of participants, and we've got live streaming on YouTube as well. So hopefully, thanks to our friends at the National Children's Bureau, who are our secretariat, have put this all together, the next hour and a half, 2 hours is going to go absolutely seamlessly. with all our live speakers and presentations, and I'm going to try and keep it tight to time because we've got an awful lot to get in, and I do want to get people able to ask questions and make comments as well. Just a few sort of housekeeping points before we start. We've got a number of parliamentarians and officers of the all-party group who are tuning in virtually, and they can introduce themselves when they ask questions later on. Can I ask everybody to mute themselves? By the looks of it, most people have done that. And if you want to ask a question, there'll be some slots for questions after some of the speakers, and then hopefully if we run to time, there'll be a bigger slot for more questions at the end. If you go to the participants button, at the bottom of that, there is a hand up icon. So if you want to ask a question, click on that, and I will try and notice you and bring you in if we've got time. If not, my apologies, but as I say, we've got quite a lot to cover. As I say, this is being live streamed on YouTube, so we've got a lot of people who are following us beyond the audience who are engaged with this. We've also got a number of media attending, and particularly a shout out to Nick Cecil at the Evening Standard, who recently launched a campaign on making sure that children in the COVID crisis are not forgotten, what we need to do to help them, which is part really of why we are here today. So obviously children are very important to all of us, but they have not always been on the radar during the coronavirus crisis. And we know from the various reports we've had from various children's groups and others that many children have not been at school, and many vulnerable children in particular have not been at school, and therefore they've been slightly off the radar. And we also know at this time that child abuse has been on the increase, domestic abuse has been on the increase. And for those children who have not been at school and are not going back until September, that could mean almost 6 months of being away from a school environment. So it's really important that we make sure that children's interests, and particularly the most vulnerable children, are represented. They are on the radar of government, and we do everything we can to make sure we get them to catch up when they come back to school, and make sure they are as safe as possible in the remaining months or however long we've got of lockdown. So this is a really timely meeting. There have been actually lots of reports coming out recently. Various children's groups got together to put forward a plea to government for how we should make sure that children are being looked after during the lockdown. Within the last hour, we've had a report, Best Beginnings, from the Children's Commissioner about how we need to do better for younger children in particular. And 2 days ago, the Children's Minister, and I'm delighted to welcome Vicky Ford here, issued some further guidance about the changes to regulations which she brought in for the crisis a while ago, and how some of those are going to be relaxed. And I'm sure Vicky will be talking about that shortly. So there's quite a lot that's been going on, but we've got some really good presentations. And so just to give those introductions, we have got, most importantly, we have got Demetrius, we have got Alicia, and we have got Disha from Young NCB. We've got Kimberlyn and Sylvie, who are parents from Lambeth Early Action Partnership, which gives thousands of children aged between 0 to 3 across Lambeth a better start. We've also got representatives from a big coalition of various children's charities who are working on recovery. We've got the chair of the Education Select Committee, the Minister for Children and Families, Vicky Ford, as I said, the Shadow Minister for Children and Families, Tulip Siddiqui, and senior representatives from Public Health England, NHS England, and the Department for Education. So a really good lineup of people. What could possibly go wrong? So without further ado, let's start off. We're first of all going to hear from some of our, as I say, most important participants, from children and young people and parents, about the issues that matter to them. And we're also going to have a short video which has been prepared especially for this. So without further ado, Demetrius, over to you.
Hello and thank you. I'm Demetrius Makesons and I am a young NCB member and the Member of Youth Parliament for North West Hampshire. I am absolutely pleased to be introducing this amazing film produced for you all today, as it clearly delivers across the voices of young people, voices that I particularly think have not been heard nor considered by the government during this pandemic. So today's meeting is a step, as I'm sure my fellow colleagues would agree, forward for young people's voices finally being acknowledged.
Demetrius, thank you. You're going to hand over to Sylvie, I think.
Yes.
Sylvie, are you there? Yes, Sylvie, welcome. Can you unmute yourself, please, Sylvie? Some steak I always make.
Yes.
We can
Good
hear you.
afternoon.
Sylvie, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sylvie Blanchoucou. I'm a parent champion and parent representative of Torsil Award for Torsil. And I took a part in one of our discussion with parents of children under 4 in Lambeth to talk about the family need and to support recovery from COVID. And this video is really is a stepping stone, you know, to stand out for our community, for the government to take children and family matters, education and well-being at heart in their plan. And we took a video. This video is just a short one. It's just a short clip for some of the issues we discuss about. And what I know the government talk about a lot of young people, school age, getting homeschooling at home, but what they haven't talked about or plan or come out with solution, it's about children under 4. Children under 4 are not really left behind. And we represent the family here at Lambeth, and we want to give this opportunity to be a voice. We want their voice to be heard, and so that the government can put their well-being and during their plan at the plan they're going to make. I want the government really to have the family and the children at the heart of their plan. And talking less also, I know that there's a strong Black and minority ethnic community at Lambeth who we know were really affected worse by this virus, and we want these families' voice to be heard. And that's what I would say, yeah.
Thank you, Sylvie. Right, are we playing the video now? Who's in control of the video?
Yes, that's me. I'm about to share.
Well done.
Oh.
We don't have sound, I think.
Okay, let me just try again. Won't be 1 second.
All of the like things that make life normal, you know, seeing your friends. I've lost a lot of opportunities, and I've also lost my sense of independence from it for the time being as well.
I've missed other people in my family, like my granddad.
Makes you realise like how impactful that is on your mental health when it's all just like suddenly taken away from you.
I'm in year 11, so I would have finished my GCSEs and would have been on holiday right now.
We're having to do university applications and consider what universities we want to go to without being able to go to campus. We're not going to get told my predicted grades until September. It just kind of feels like we're all left in the dark and no one has any ideas.
In the early stages of lockdown, it was very hard because, as I said, my partner is shielding. So literally we were indoors for 2 months without even going outside onto the main road or to the shops, anything. So at that stage, she found it a bit difficult because she just didn't understand, why am I not going to nursery? She wakes up and she speaks about going to nursery every day. So I know she definitely misses that routine of seeing her friends, doing things in a certain order.
Suddenly the whole scaring her into, we can't touch other people, we can't go close to other people. And it's like, well, why is this happening? At the beginning, we had really hard meltdowns. She was hitting, throwing toys, like breaking them and everything. And after like 3 or 4 of those big meltdowns, we actually kind of got through to her. And she was being just like, well, this whole lockdown is just too much. Like, I miss my friends, I miss my nursery, I miss my play groups.
Both my dad and mum are key workers, so nothing's changed. They still went to work. No one's working from home. But I'm at home. My brother and sister are at home. I have to feed them. I have to, make sure that they're doing some sort of schoolwork so they don't, come into September, because they're all moving up. But it's been difficult because I've got my own schoolwork, of course.
We're not allowed to walk anywhere by ourselves anymore.
Because I'm a young carer, we've had no government guidance for us especially. We've been left in the dark from this whole COVID-19. There's a new generation of young carers that have come from it. And it's like, those are young people who have had no experience in the system at all and have had to learn to care and learn to do everything while no one is there. And I think it's a really important thing that the government listen.
It kind of feels like the world stopped, and yet we're still supposed to keep doing everything.
Parents have been left behind because of they don't have the information. For example, those that don't have internet or laptop or any, media, social media interaction. So they're missing out, even the children as well.
The feeling that you've just been, a passenger in all of this and you haven't been able to put an input in.
Throughout this whole process, young people's voices are not heard.
We shouldn't just like that go back into kind of education, just expect children to be entirely comfortable with going straight back into their kind of usual school lifestyle. I think like maybe this sort of like integration back in to slowly get them readjusted and accustomed to it.
Parents who are immigrants are left out of a lot of the services. For example, having your visa doesn't entitle you to certain services. For example, the NRF, which is on a lot of visas, no recourse to public funds. You have to work to sustain yourself. You're not able to get social housing and all the rest of it. I can see it blatantly. Your child will then suffer because you're going to be bringing that child to a friend, a cousin, everyone where you don't have to spend that much money. And if you do have to send them to a setting where you're going to have to pay, again, you're not going to be that active parent that you want to be.
What the government was giving me for the childcare, it wasn't sufficient. So I would like them to look into that to help whether couple or single parents or charm of childcare for them to ease them so that anything they're doing or for them to get back to work or to get something into activity to earn and also to have something sustained amount, for them to live a normal life.
There's going to be a huge divide with young people from shielded or immune compromised backgrounds compared to those not. I think because obviously there's no guarantee that those young people can go back into education in September for the safety of their own family.
Group sessions where you can just talk about this whole traumatizing thing. And let's be honest, it is traumatizing for all of us, for not just the children. It's
an acknowledgement and appreciation of mental health kind of struggles that will come out of this.
Opening the libraries again, that would be amazing.
Having more services to do with befriending. I think it's one of the key things that we could utilize in the future, as in having a connection with parents who are isolated.
I'd like to see the government do more for those who are unpaid carers.
Better bereavement support for those of us that have lost loved ones during the pandemic. I would like the government to prove that they listen.
I would like some guidance for the future because it's kind of uncertain.
Right. Well, there was an awful lot packed into that 6-minute video. One of the lines that struck me, who was it who said, it kind of feels like the world has stopped, but we're supposed to go on doing everything. Now, there's a couple of questions we've prioritized for the Minister and the Shadow Minister to start with, and any of the young people involved in that who are on and the parents would like to answer this. So can I go to Vicky Ford first, the Minister, who's going to ask a question? Vicky.
Yes, thank you. It's really, really helpful to hear the voices of children and young people there. And we have been listening, and maybe I can address some of the specific questions when I speak later. But I guess my question for you is, if there's one thing you'd like me to take away from this, what would it be? And as we go back into the new normal and that really important move in September of getting all children and young people back at school, which is so important for seeing friends, for making contacts, for feeling back in touch again, are there lessons that you want to take from this time that would mean that going forward would be a bit different? Are there things that have been good at this time that you would like to carry on with? I've heard from some young people who've found that sometimes being online has helped them stay in touch. So that would be one thought for me. I've heard your point.
Okay.
Is one thing you want, but is there some good that you'd also like to take forward?
Who would like to answer that? Out of Demetrius, Alicia, Disha, who would like to come back on that? Because there are a few upsides, there's an awful lot of downsides, but there are a few things that might be different in the future that we can learn from. Alicia, you've got your hand up.
Something that I definitely think in terms of what we can take forward is that me, Demetrius and Disha are just 3 young people. I couldn't even put a number to it of how many young people that are willing to put their voice out there and be heard, but they're being silenced because there isn't enough being done to consult them. Because this, at the end of the day, it's our future. We want the opportunity to be a part of it and not just have it go past and we're just there sitting on the ride. But in terms of something that's been really good is that I found that a lot of schools are doing more now to try and ensure that students are still being supported. I know the Children's Society here are pushing for a wellbeing checkup, and I know my school has done it themselves. And I think I've heard a lot more schools doing that, which is really helpful. There's also been a lot done within community, and I think that's something we need to take forward, is that the community spirit, we don't want to lose it once this pandemic has gone. We want to continue doing it and continue to show that compassion and love that each community does have, if that kind of answers your question.
Thanks, Alicia. They're quite a bit. That's some interesting points there. Minister, do you want to come back, and then I get to go to Tulip?
Yes, Alicia, thank you. Those are really, really good points. And I'm so glad your school asked you to come back for that wellbeing check, because that was one of the things that I really wanted to make sure was possible this term. And actually, I sent out some advice to schools on how to prepare themselves for that check. So I'm really, really glad to hear it was helpful. And in terms of consulting with children, you're absolutely right that we must hear children's voices. And we've tried to work very closely with the Children's Society that you mentioned, NCB, Childline, so the NSPCC. We actually invested in quite a lot of money in the NSPCC to increase their capacity. And it's finding those forums so that they can help make sure that your voice gets heard as well. So how we can continue to build on that going forward is really important. And now Bernardo's are going to be cross because I didn't mention them, but they've also been fantastic at this time. So thank you.
Other good children's charities are available, absolutely.
Yes.
Tulip Siddiq, the Shadow Children's Minister. Tulip, you've got a question, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for that video. When you go back to school, my question is quite similar to the minister's. What do you think needs to be different this term to make it easier for you and your friends to settle back in? What extra help or support do you think you'll need from teachers? That's really what I want to hear from the young people. And I have 2 children myself. They're very small, so their needs are very different from the children going back to school. My children are going back to nursery. So I guess I just want to know, what do you think you'll need from your teachers and from school and from authorities to make life easier when you go back?
Thanks, Tulip. Does Disha or Demetrius would like to take that one this time, either of you? Disha?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of points. I think that mental health support and support for children who've lost a loved one during this really difficult time is so important, to make sure that young people can feel integrated and start to recover from the effects that COVID-19 and lockdown has had on them. I'm actually in year 12 at the moment, so my cohort, a lot of young people are applying to university and things like that at the moment, and some of the deadlines for some courses and universities are in October, and so when we go back to school in September, there's obviously such a quick turnaround, and for those from state schools and disadvantaged backgrounds who haven't been given the support over the lockdown period that they need to give them the support for applications, I think are going to suffer disproportionately. And I think I'm really concerned that that's going to affect uptake into further education as well, especially from those who go to state schools or are from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think changing the dates or providing additional support is so crucial to help that.
Thanks, Disha. That's very well put, I think.
Demetrius, did you want to add anything?
Well, from a different point of view, from somebody who is in year 9, I guess the kind of support I completely actually agree with Disha is that young people's mental health will have seriously been impacted by the amount of isolation from their friends, but now social distancing guidelines have started to ease, meaning that they're able to meet with with their friends outside. But actually, when we go back to school, it's that acknowledgement that things are going to start getting better, that actual emotional support from teachers saying that, okay, there's that, and this is what guidance is available for you if you're struggling, and what support. It's almost that signposting material for young people to get help if they need it, and that support from the NSPCC or from Childline and things like that, like the Minister mentioned.
And Demetrius, did you have any of that via Zoom already during the lockdown, or not really?
Sorry,
Anybody?
do you mind repeating that?
Demetrius?
Did you have any of that support that you've mentioned, any of that guidelines via Zoom, like Zoom calls or over online?
It really does depend. You do have to really dig and search for that support, but Childline and NSPCC have continued to operate throughout this whole time, and it's been really beneficial for a large amount of young people to see that support, and it continued. And everyone did welcome the government's approach to new and more funding being put into the NSPCC to continue to operate during lockdown with reduced staff.
Okay, we're going to move on now. Clearly, mental health and the impact it's had on young people is going to be considerable, which is why I think it's really important. Somebody mentioned the wellbeing checkup. I think that was you, Alicia, because different young people are going to be affected differently if they haven't been at school at all. If you are in that year that were leaving school and going on to another school, or leaving school to go on to university, then all of a sudden it came to an abrupt halt in March, and you don't have all the usual sort of end of your school career before you go to a bigger school or university to sort of adapt to it. My children are a bit older now, but my youngest was in her final term at university, and so she had to do all her exams online, but she didn't get to say goodbye to all her friends properly and do all the end of term, end of university career celebration stuff and everything as well. And it must be even harder for younger people leaving one school and going on to a bigger school as well. So really important that all that's taken into account when we start the new academic year properly at last, we hope, in September. Thank you very much, everybody, for that session. You're all staying part of this, but we're going to go on now to hear from the children's sector and 2 representatives from the children's charities. First of all, we've got Matthew Dodd from the NCB, who's part of the Secretariat, and then Sam Royston from the Children's Society. But Matt, can I hand over to you first?
Thank you, Tim. It is a privilege to be here with you all today and to follow our young people and parents. This APPG meeting comes at an incredibly important time in the lives of every child, young person and parent in this country. That's why the National Children's Bureau worked with 160 organisations so that when Boris Johnson gave his first major speech on recovery on the 30th of June, we came together to ask him to put children at the heart of his recovery plans. Our big ask was that children and young people become one of the 3 pillars of the government's recovery strategy alongside the nation's health and the economy. And you can see the images of those organisations up on the screen. When the Chancellor made his summer statement last week, we came together again to ask him to put children at the heart of the Treasury's investment decisions. We welcomed the Kickstart scheme to support employment for young people, but there are many other aspects of children and young people's lives that we think demand attention too. We'd like to put on the record, we'll continue to ask for this politely, but also with urgency as we move into the autumn with a full budget and possibly a spending review. And while it's true that we feel that children and young people haven't had the national attention they deserve, that doesn't mean we don't recognise the hard work, the dedication and the priority given to children and young people during this crisis by many of the people on this call. This includes ministers and the minister who's here today, of course. It includes officials in government departments, parliamentarians and those working in arm's length bodies. So put on the record our thanks for all of those who put in so many extra hours under such challenging circumstances to do the best for children. We've also seen a lot of excellent examples of cross-government work during the pandemic and also a real willingness from government to work with the voluntary sector to find solutions. So long may that continue. A few words on our work on recovery. And I guess the first thing to be really clear about is that the children's sector has accepted the use of the word recovery, but that doesn't mean we want things to go back to exactly how they were before. You know, 2 examples, whether that's the financial state of local authorities' children's services, the waiting times to see a mental health professional, or the levels of child poverty. We know we can do better than this. So what do we want to see? I just want to draw people's attention to our Vision for Recovery document. We circulated that with the invitation. It's got a set of principles that many of our organisations have signed up to. There's 8 of them, but I'm not going to go into detail with all of them. I just draw attention to 3 of them. The first one is an integrated and joined up response. We know that children don't fit easily into boxes called education, health and social care. So that's why we think we need a single cross-departmental approach and strategy for children and young people. We've written to the Children's Minister and we hope she'll agree to lead such an approach. In keeping with what we've already heard from our young people and parents, they've got to be seen as partners. And it's only by genuinely listening to children, young people and parents that we can understand what they need and make the right policies for them. And then finally, respecting children's rights and entitlements. We want to see realisation of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child as a sort of guiding framework when thinking about recovery, and particularly those with a focus on those whose rights are often most at risk. That's just a flavour, and we hope you'll read the full document. So to sum up, we don't think we can go back to how things were before, but we are now given a unique chance to build something better. So we hope the APPG for Children, the Minister and everyone else in this room will work with us to make that happen. I'll now hand over to Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Matt. Sam.
Thanks, Matt. We all know that the government will want to build on such a great set of principles set out by Matt, and indeed all of the amazing things young people have said today in delivering a recovery that really works for children. But we also know that this takes time, and we know the pressures that officials working really heroically across government departments are under right now as they respond to the pandemic. And it's for this reason that experts from across the children's sector have been working closely together to consider how we can support the government by identifying the actions needed to build a recovery which does put children at heart. Together, we have produced a set of briefings building on the principles that Matthew has set out to begin to set out an approach for delivering a recovery which works for children across 6 key areas: child poverty and social security, mental health and well-being, early years recovery, supporting children in care and care leavers, safeguarding and child protection, and school returns. It outlines a huge set of recommendations for government, the beginnings of a blueprint which could make recovery work for children. Together, they also outline many of the gaps in current policy which still need to be addressed. And as we have heard from young people over the last few moments, too often we find that these are gaps relating to support for children. For example, increases in the basic element of universal credit provided to support the basic needs of adults in a household have been hugely welcome, but there hasn't been a corresponding increase in support for children. Our child poverty briefing recommends these increases are mirrored in child benefit or the child element of child tax credit to make sure that children's needs are addressed in the same way as adults. Furthermore, in some cases, there are concerns that without a more robust response, CV19 may further ingrain existing inequalities in outcomes between children. For example, it must be recognised that widespread school closures have had and will continue to have a marked impact on children's academic outcomes and are likely to further increase the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers. We are particularly concerned about the impact of this on children in care, who may, for example, not see fair reflections of their likely attainment in predicted grades. For that reason, our briefing on children in care and care leavers recommends that schools and colleges work closely together with virtual school heads, designated teachers and other social care professionals to ensure exam grade predictions submitted are fair. Some children may be left in a position which is simply unsafe. Our safeguarding briefing recommends that local safeguarding partnerships should be supported to put in place local recovery plans mapping the key impacts of COVID-19 on keeping children safe in their areas and specifying the actions needed to address them. Addressing support for children must also mean supporting the children's workforce. And that's why our early years recovery briefing recommends that health visitors must be fully financially resourced and supported to enable them to reinstitute face-to-face contacts for families. And as we emerge from lockdown, many of the responses may not sufficiently respond to the new realities with which we are faced. For example, young people returning to school are going to face a very different environment from the one they left. As highlighted by a number of the young people this session, children will take some time to reintegrate back into school life and to re-establish friendships and routines. The briefings recommend that the initial school timetable as pupils return to the classroom should focus on well-being and not solely on academic catch-up. This should be backed by a commitment to the measurement of children's well-being. Similarly, too often responses have been understandably short-term, responding to the emergency as it develops. But this means some longer term issues have been left on the sidelines. For example, it's been great to see the government invest an additional £63 million in emergency financial support for households facing financial crisis through local welfare assistance. However, that money is likely to cover just 3 months of emergency needs. We have recommended that the government put local welfare assistance on long-term footing, supported by at least £250 million per year of funding for councils to deliver this. This is only a snapshot of some of the issues identified through this set of briefings. We hope that taken as a whole, the briefings and the recommendations going with them help make a start in setting out an approach to ensure that children are at the heart of Britain's approach to recovery. And all the briefings are available online, so please do read through. But there is still much more to do. To take the next steps, we need to work closely between the third sector, parliamentarians, government departments, and children and young people themselves to ensure we are aligned in our responses and are working together to maximise the capacity available to respond together. I hope the organisations involved in producing these briefings can continue to work closely with everyone on the call today to ensure the lessons set out are further built upon as the government delivers plans for recovery, which put children at its heart.
Sam, thank you very much. Matt, thank you very much. I presume those briefings will be available on the Children's Society and NCB website for people who want more detail.
They are. I'll put the link up on the chat as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Now, look, I'm being a rubbish chairman. We're already running over time. I've had lots of comments back to me from parliamentarians in particular, really impressed with that video, saying thank you very much, particularly raising points around the challenges for young carers, and some really powerful points made by Alicia. And those young people who become carers for the first time during the pandemic, or that they've experienced loss within their family and close friends as well, and the very particular support obviously they're going to need when they go back to school, and the practical challenges of going back to school if all of a sudden you become a carer as well. So really good, strong stuff so far. Thank you very much for that. I'm also aware, I know Kimberly and Sylvie wanted to come back. We just didn't have time. I will try and bring you back in at the end, the two of the parents. If we have enough time, then we'll have questions and I'll prioritise you at the end. Right, so moving swiftly on, we've now got Robert Halfon, who's the chair of the House of Commons Education Select Committee and a former Minister for Apprenticeship and Skills, so who's a great friend of the children's sector. Rob, are you there?
Hello. Yes, I am. I hope you can hear me. Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
Good
background's not as good as my background. But
well,
anyway.
I saw your background, Tim, and rather than having my books, I thought I'd put my Parliament, where I normally sit in the House of Commons, as a background, just to try and compete with you, Tim, as they're having the best backdrop of any MP I've seen. Welcome, everyone. That was really nice to hear, especially from the younger students and pupils. Because everything you said is all the kind of things that we are looking at in our Education Committee in Parliament, which I chair. And it's good that the shadow ministers are here. And I work very closely with Vicky Ford, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who is a extraordinarily good listening minister. And thank you to Tim, who is the champion of children in Parliament. I don't think there's any other MP who does more than you. Who's not on the government benches. So thank you for organising all this, and to the National Children's Bureau, everyone else at the APPG. And we should also acknowledge that parents, teachers, support staff, social workers, charities, volunteers are the unsung heroes of the coronavirus crises. They've worked incredibly hard to ensure that disadvantaged children, and that's what our whole committee, we are looking at those children who are left behind this year, addressing social injustice in education. They make sure that the children, as much as possible, are learning, supported, cared for and fed. And why does this matter? Because, as has already been described in the video, disadvantaged and vulnerable children have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and they have to be front and centre of the national recovery. In my view, there is a potential ice age coming in terms of educational progress because of what's happened. Every single day that a child has been out of the classroom has chipped away at their future life chances. And we know that over 80% of vulnerable children have not attended school during lockdown. That's despite the efforts of the government, despite the fact that the schools were open. And we need to look at the lessons learned to understand why so many children were not at school or even learning. And my concern is that there could be an epidemic of educational poverty, a safeguarding crisis, with children facing online harms, joining county gangs, or facing very tough situations at home. There was a survey from an organisation called Teacher Tap that does polling for teachers that suggested that 55% of teachers from the most disadvantaged school thought that their average pupil in their class was learning for less than 1 hour a day. And a survey of 900 teachers suggested that 700,000 children were not doing any schoolwork at all. Another academic study by the University College London said that over 2 million children were not have not done any schoolwork during the lockdown. And another study from another group said that 40% of children had had very little contact with their teachers. And I find that profoundly worrying, not because I'm some kind of grad grind, but because we know how important education, well-being is for younger children particularly, but all pupils. And not learning for 6 months is an eternity in some ways in a child's life, and that I think is a genuine national disaster for us as a country. And we know even before the crisis that disadvantaged pupils were over 18 months behind non-disadvantaged pupils when they left secondary school. The Education Endowment Foundation has said that it will widen, that COVID will widen the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers, reversing potentially the progress made over the last decade. So when the government announced the £1 billion catch-up programme, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because that is very important. And I was campaigning that for a long time, as was Tim, all the time in Parliament. And that is going to be mega important. It's got to benefit the disadvantaged and left behind pupils who need it the most. We as a committee, I'm sorry to say this, Vicky, we've written another letter to the department, but I don't think it's to you. I think it was to Nick Gibb, but just to ask exactly how that £1 billion is going to be targeted, because the catch-up work has to begin now. And where I agree with Tim absolutely, and others, is we should be having summer schools. Schools are able to open them, and in Essex, where I live, and Vicky is my neighbouring MP, they are going to have summer camps and schools over the summer. They're doing a great work, but this should happen everywhere. Children need to go back to school as soon as possible, not just to learn, but as has been highlighted, for well-being pastoral care, because I worry that there is going to be serious problems with mental health. It is already becoming an epidemic in our country, and that's one thing. I've been an MP since 2010, and if one thing that has struck me over the years that seems to be just getting worse and worse is the mental health of all our citizens, young and old, across our country, and we really need to do something about it. So the summer programs will be valuable breaks for children to undertake the activities to improve their physical and mental well-being and accessing catch-up education. And I've become much more of a I've been in lockdown. I've been at home for 16 weeks because I have a disability and I've been a shielded person. So I have hardly left my home. And the one thing that I've realized, just going to the garden, is just how important nature is, and parks. And I think we need to have a national renewal of parks, of nature, of the environment, in a way that, because study after study shows that it benefits mental health. And there is a book out by a journalist called The Natural Health Service. It's by somebody called Isabel Hardman, who writes for the Spectator magazine, and I think that she has a serious point. And I think playing fields, parks, the environment has to be a very important part of if a renewal of it all for children's education. We know that up to 1 million children may not have had access to a computer or the internet, even with the superb Oak Academy that the government and teacher worked with. Digital poverty disproportionately affects children in low-income families. Research by the respected Sutton Trust said that students in the most deprived areas were least likely to have been provided with a laptop by their school for work. And the government's laptop scheme is welcome, but what I actually think should happen, and we've just written a letter to the Secretary of State for Culture as a committee, that TV broadcasters need to set up a national education broadcasting service over the summer that parents can access. I know there is BBC Bite Size, but literally that's the name. It's not called Bite Size for nothing, because it's just for a short time. What I'm talking about is literally for a good few hours a day. There will be a TV channel and on radio for those who have disabilities in terms of sight, to access education, learning, pastoral care on television. We've literally just written to Oliver Dowden about that, because whilst many families don't have proper internet, most families have a television. 95% of homes have a television. So children's educational content should be available on TV, and the broadcasters should get together to have this going on all day. Our committee, we published a report on exams only on Saturday, and we highlighted the lack of guaranteed support for teaching for students doing autumn exams. And because children can choose whether or not to do to have their grades assessed in the way that it's going to be, or to do autumn exams. And what we're worried about, there isn't a level playing field for those students who are doing the autumn exams. And we're worried that the exam system could be unfair for disadvantaged students, for children from BAME backgrounds, people with SEND. So we've put forward some recommendations to try and make sure that the grades are fair, and that students do have access to proper learning over the summer, because the catch-up programme from the government, which is, as I said, a really fantastic thing, and they should be credited when they do the right thing. It doesn't apply to post-16 students if they're resitting exams in FE colleges and the like. So we want the catch-up fund extended for disadvantaged post-16 students. Just a few other things before I end. We want also an early years package that will be crucial for recovery. I'm sure that Vicky, who's done a lot, will set out I hope, a long-term plan for childcare and nurseries, just to make sure they have financial stability in terms of private provision, and also strong support for our incredibly successful maintained nurseries. I mean, I am a conservative. People say, do you believe in big government or small government? I just believe in good government. I mean, our maintained nurseries are an example at government and the state at its best, and we should be waving the flag for them and supporting them in every possible way. The waiving in terms of children with special educational needs, and our committee has done a huge amount of work on this, one of the biggest ever inquiries any select committee, an 18-month inquiry. We have asked the experts, and one of them actually, Ms. Stobbs, came. I think she is your trustee on the National Children's Bureau, and she came to our committee, and we asked them, had children with special educational needs, have they been left behind more than other children during the pandemic? They say, and I recognise the work that Vicky is doing, and she cares about this deeply, but they argued that they have been left behind and there are significant problems. The waiving of the Section 42 duty and the reasonable endeavours duty has led to children and families struggling for support during the lockdown. And this is not to point fingers, this is inevitable. We're in a state of national emergency, but we have to recognise that this is the case. And it's very encouraging that the government does not believe it will be necessary to renew the temporary easements that relate to education, healthcare assessments and plans. But the relaxation of the timeframes for education and healthcare plan decisions mean that children in need of urgent assessment support have had to wait much longer, and many SEND children have missed out on specialist therapies during the lockdown. So we need also, as well as the catch-up provision of a post-16 and funding, just to be clear what plans there are to support children with special educational needs. So
Rob, we're running short on time.
Your good news, Tim, I've finished. So I just want to say that's a roundup of everything that we are doing. We're focusing on the left behind children, and it's been good to learn from you today. Thank you.
Rob, thank you very much. A really comprehensive collection of things there, but an epidemic of education poverty at its core. And thank you for all the reports that your committee has been doing around this subject, and particularly around exams and the pressure on those people taking public exams as well. Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Without further ado, we're going to go straight to the Minister, Vicky Ford. We've got a few questions for Vicky as well, and then I'm going to come to Tulip Speak afterwards. Minister, I hope you're still there.
I am still there.
You are, very good.
Once I've managed to get the unmute button correct. Just thank you so much for inviting me this afternoon, and thank you for bringing everyone together. I'd like to particularly start off by thanking the children and young people who are with us in this meeting and all of those who took part in that very powerful video. As they so clearly said, this has been a very challenging time for children and families. It's been especially challenging for children who've been bereaved, for children in care, for young carers, care leavers, children with disabilities, and also many children and young people from different ethnic minority groups. Protecting vulnerable children is at the heart of the government's response, both in our initial response and in how we plan for the future. And throughout this time, I've been listening to voices on the front line, both young people's voices, but also those who care with them. So, for example, meeting with foster carers, meeting with children with disabilities, meeting many different organisations who represent children and their families, to really try and understand how this time has felt for them, and to try and put in measures as we went along to support them and to inform the government's approach. We really do welcome those principles put forward by NCB that you outlined now, and that have been endorsed and developed by over 160 different charities. It's a huge piece of work. And in government, as you mentioned, we've changed our way of working to really try and understand how children's and families' needs have changed, and to provide an integrated cross-government approach. And we've set up a task and finish group that brings together all government departments to focus especially on vulnerable children. And the support that we've put in place for vulnerable children has been extensive. We are one of only a very few countries in the entire world who said from the start that we wanted to keep schools open for all vulnerable children. That's children with a social worker, children with an EHC plan, and other vulnerable children. And for those children most at risk of harm, children with child protection plans, our social workers across the country have worked to keep eyes and ears on those children, even if they were not at school. So can I also say a big thank you to teachers, to those in school staff, early years providers, and social workers as well. As many have said, school is vital, not just for education, but also for well-being and to protect children from harm. And we're absolutely determined to get all children and young people back into their school or education settings as soon as possible. In fact, based on the latest data of the last couple of weeks, over 1.5 million children and young people have been back attending their education setting. And that includes over 135,000 children who are in this group of other vulnerable. And many of those children and young people are vulnerable because of well-being needs. So schools have prioritised bringing them back. We mustn't let children with special educational needs and disabilities be left further behind by the pandemic. So we've been working incredibly closely with special schools to make sure that they can reopen full-time and fully in line with mainstream schools in September. And then, of course, the massive £1 billion catch-up package, 2/3 of that will go to across all schools over the whole of next year to support our education settings, putting in the right catch-up. And that's not just educational catch-up, it's also well-being support for when children return. And the other third of the package, of course, is for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of the young people have spoken about the importance of mental health and well-being, and we are absolutely committed to enhancing mental health and well-being. We've advised schools to increase pastoral support and well-being support through next year. We've given teachers new resources on mental health and well-being as part of the RHSC curriculum. We've provided them with training and advice. Our webinar last week to give training to teachers was attended by over 10,000 teachers, and other professionals have signed up to that webinar. given that will go on and being available over the summer. We've worked with health colleagues to put more investment into frontline mental health charities, to expand the new 24/7 mental health telephone services and make sure that they're available to people of all ages, and to make sure that NHS mental health services remain open for those who need that enhanced level of mental health support. And indeed, the NHS is prioritising children's mental health services. In terms of worries about the future, we know that many children and young people are worried about the future, and we're absolutely committed to unlocking opportunities for them. And that was why in the jobs package from the Chancellor last week, there was such an emphasis on opportunities for young people, not just the Kickstart programme that Sam kindly mentioned, but also traineeships, sector-based work academy placements, more apprenticeships, to really make sure that children and young people get the chance to gain experience in the workplace, build up their skills, and improve their chances of finding long-term opportunities in the future. It's been mentioned a bit, but we know that many vulnerable children are at risk of harm, both inside and outside the home, and we are committed to supporting those vulnerable children. We work with the NSPCC to expand their helpline, especially the support that they give to identifying children at risk of harm. The social media campaign there reached over 6.4 million people. And as a result of that campaign, over 7,500 referrals for children at risk of harm were made to children's services, and over 2,000 referrals were made to the police. So even though schools didn't have eyes on those children often because they were outside the social services system, many other people did, and the NSPCC helpline really helped with that action. And now we're working with Bernardo's and other charities on a project called See, Hear and Respond, which is to provide targeted support for vulnerable children and young people, and especially in there for young carers. I was very touched by the comments from the young carer on the call. And then we set up lots of different networks of support for different groups. For care leavers, we've ensured that they can stay where they are. They don't need to leave where they're living at during this time. We've prioritized them to give them laptops and devices so they can stay connected. We've supported 61,000 adoptive families with support from the Adoption Support Fund, and we've supported 72,000 families of disabled children through extra support from the Families Fund. We supported children at risk of domestic abuse by working with the police to roll out Operation Encompass, which brings together police and schools. And for the very concerning comments from the member who spoke on the video about those with no recourse to public funds, we've increased that they can access free school meals. And indeed, a huge amount of my time during this period was establishing the free school meals voucher system to make sure that we could get funding for school meals. And of course, that's now gone into the COVID summer food project. I know you wanted me to update people on the changes to the law, which I'd previously spoken about in Parliament. At the height of the pandemic, we needed to put in place flexibilities in children's social care regulations to balance the needs of children and young people with the abilities of local authorities and health services and education settings to respond to the outbreak, and especially to respond even if there were significant workforce pressures. But thankfully across the country, many workforces have largely managed that pressure, and the majority of those flexibilities have been very rarely used. I've therefore updated the guidance and written to local authorities to make it clear that they should no longer be using the vast majority of those flexibilities, and I intend for the vast majority of those amendments to lapse as planned on the 25th of September. But we know that the impact of the pandemic's not yet over. And as more children come back to school, we do need to be prepared for additional demands that could be placed on children's services. And so this week I'm launching a consultation to extend a very small number of temporary changes for another temporary period, but it is a temporary period. The three that I'm consulting on are firstly, enabling medical reports that are required to approve potential adopters and foster carers to be provided at a later stage in the adoption or fostering process. We do need adopters, we do need foster carers, but we don't want to make sure that the understandable delays in the NHS don't lead to unnecessary delays in children's services. Secondly, we want to ensure that children can still contact social workers even when households have to self-isolate due to COVID cases or local lockdowns. So in those very specific cases of self-isolation because of COVID or local lockdowns, we'll still permit virtual visits by social workers, but only when a face-to-face visit is simply not practicable. And finally, I want to enable Ofsted to phase in their return, excuse me, frog in my throat. I want to enable Ofsted to phase in their return to children's social care inspections between now and April. They need to go through a phased return in order to be able to get back to normal. And so that's the third thing.
Okay.
Just really quickly, an enormous amount of work has been done. Every child is important. And even at this challenging time, every decision must be made in the best interest of the individual child. And we are absolutely committed to supporting vulnerable children, safeguarding them now and in the future. And that goes for not only myself and my colleagues in DFE, but colleagues all across government. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. There's an awful lot that's crammed into there. Can I just, because we are running over time, and Tulip, would you mind if I just swapped you around, because we've got Professor Viv Bennett, the chief nurse, who has to go by 3:20. So if I can bring Professor Bennett in after just taking a couple of questions to Vicky now, so we've still got her, because Tulip, I think luckily we've got you for the rest of the session, if that will be okay. We've just got
Tim, you haven't got me for the rest of the session because I've got to pick up my child, but I can wait a bit longer, so that's
Is that
fine.
all right? Fine, right. We're just going to take a couple of quick questions. Can I ask Nick Cecil from the Standard first? Nick, and thank you for your campaign on children catching up as well during COVID.
Yes, hi Tim. And could I ask the Minister, please, how many children, extra children, do you expect to seek mental health support as a result of the COVID crisis, and what additional support will be given to this group?
So Nick, thank you for that. So we all know that children and young people will have had a variety of different experiences, anxiety, stress, low mood, and it is absolutely normal to have those sorts of responses in such an abnormal time. Okay, this is what I keep being told by the mental health experts. And it's also absolutely vital that the government's committed to supporting mental health and well-being. Okay, so we know that some will have well-being issues and some may have more intense mental health illness issues. The well-being and pastoral support is the issue that we've asked all schools to focus on, to make sure they're there and providing them with that extra advice, that extra training, that extra support. So in terms of numbers, you'd need to, I'm afraid, ask my mental health colleague in terms of numbers, but making sure that children's mental health services are available has been key. I understand the waiting times are actually down at this time on accessing children's mental health services, and also giving them the access to that 24/7 helpline, which was an initiative that was rolled out during this period. It was intended to do it anyway, but we accelerated during this period. So that's another way we put in extra support. Long term, of course, we have our government commitment to the Green Paper for long-term supports and the huge investment that's going into NHS mental health support. Actually, can I just say something to you, Nick, because you've
very quickly, please, Minister.
It's been very, very important that you have very responsible journalism, which I can thank you for. There has been some less responsible journalism. There was an article last week suggesting that children and malnourishment had gone to exceptional numbers. And I've been checking the data around that, and there are considerable doubts about that story. I'm still checking the details with the NHS, but stories like that can push up a huge amount of anxiety. And it's really, really important for us as politicians and journalists that we have very accurate stories. So thank you for working with us to try and make sure that we get accurate stories. Okay, thank you.
Okay, can I very quickly, and we'll have to have a tight answer, Kimberlyn, and then I'll come to Disha as well. If we have two questions together, and a quick answer, please, to the Minister, and then I want to go to the Chief Nurse. Kimberlyn?
Sure, thank you all. So, Minister, quick question. Before the pandemic, many families with young children in Lambeth were already vulnerable due to socioeconomic constraints. For example, migrant families. Now these families are struggling even more due to the impact of the pandemic and lockdown. Going forward, how will you ensure that vulnerable and isolated families with babies and toddlers, as well as pregnant women, will be fully supported to recover from the impact of COVID-19?
Thanks, Kimberlyn. And Disha?
Losing a loved one is difficult for any young person. However, COVID-19 has made dealing with grief even more difficult. Not being able to attend funerals or meet with wider family has had serious mental health repercussions. What will the government do to ensure the millions of young people struggling to deal with grief have access to adequate support?
Disha, thanks very much. Vicky, I think you've got about a minute, I'm afraid.
Okay, so two really important points. Kimberlyn, it's been particularly difficult for people with very small babies, especially as maternity services have had very limited support, and there's been limited support with health visitors. But I'm really, really glad that health visitors are getting back to normal, supporting people with mums with tiny babies, especially. The catch-up programme, the £1 billion catch-up programme that we're running through the Department for Education, a third of that is focused on most disadvantaged families. So absolutely making sure that we are helping the children from those backgrounds to catch up as well. Disha, thank you for your question. I lost my dad when I was 10. I don't talk about it a lot because it still hurts. But I know for my healing, getting back to school was really, really important. And the first thing that we must do to really help support that mental health and well-being is get kids and young people back to school. And then really make sure that they get that pastoral support from the teachers that they know the best and the adults that they know the best as well there. So that's why really supporting teachers who are often great at pastoral support and well-being support, that they can get that. And then also for those who do need access to a higher level of support, working with mental health charities to get advice to children and young people on the sort of counselling support they need. And as Nick said in his question, making sure that for those who've got really serious mental illness issues, making sure that children's mental health services are open, they've stayed open, and they will remain open. Okay, so I know how challenging it is. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Minister. Thank you very much, Disha and Kimberlyn. Thank you for those questions, and thank you for being brief on the final answer, and thank you for cramming quite a lot into a short space of time. And I'm sorry we are playing catch up. But thank you very much for being with us. Now, in fact, we can revert back because the Chief Nurse has said she's got a bit longer, so we're going to prioritise childcare. And Tulip, can I come to you now? So over to you for a response from there.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone who's been involved in making this important event happen. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to all of you, and I wanted to set out some of the issues facing children now. I've mentioned that I have small children myself. I'm also a governor at a local primary school, and I was a governor for a long time at a maintained nursery in my constituency. So I'm in touch with a lot of institutions locally, and obviously through my role as Shadow Minister, I'm in touch with different children's charities and parents groups. And I wanted to speak a bit about the policy direction and that we need to go about in order to address the issues that the pandemic's shone a spotlight on. But before I do that, I particularly wanted to thank the young people who've come on this call today. I found the video very powerful, and I know a lot of people in the comments are saying that. You've taken the time to share your experiences here today and for answering our questions as well. The reason why I particularly think it's important to hear from all of you is because I do feel like the children's experiences have been hidden from view during this crisis. And part of it is probably because the virus itself doesn't impact children in the same way that it impacts the elderly. But that's obviously a very simplistic way of viewing the situation, because we know the other impacts that it's had on children, this pandemic. I've looked at the research by the Children's Commissioner for England that around 2 million children have been facing greater threats in lockdown, whether that's domestic abuse, whether that's online grooming, and everything in between. And some of these issues have been mentioned by the children on the call today. And you won't be surprised to know that this trend has been reflected in rising calls to Childline and a number of the surveys by charities. And I know lots of people are on this Zoom today, suggesting that children's well-being and mental health has declined. That issue of mental health, which gets mentioned over and over again because it's been so important in this crisis. So alongside children in the care system and those already suffering from trauma and abuse, we know that it's the poorest children and the people whose parents have lost jobs in this crisis who will be suffering most. In my constituency of Hampstead and Kilburn, it's a London constituency, there's a huge council estate, which is not too far from my house. It has a big Somali community living inside. The flats are absolutely tiny, and a lot of the families who've been isolating there have elderly grandparents living with them. So it's different generations of family living together in a very small flat, not being able to leave the flat because they don't want to impact their grandmother or grandfather. And the impact on the community has just been extremely difficult. The other reason I mentioned that is because a lot of these children are actually living in digital poverty as well. They don't have the access to devices. They don't have internet as frequently as you would think they do. They're living in even more isolated circumstances. And particularly, I wanted to mention the children in care and care leavers who face themselves in this situation. I spoke to a young parent recently who contacted my office for casework, who said that she has 4 children and they have one electronic device between them. They're all of different ages and they spend the whole day fighting each other to have Zoom calls or to access online support. So that's been very difficult for a lot of our communities in London and across the country. The other thing is, I would say, is that I've been worried about the fact that we've seen a significant decline in the referrals to the services that would support children going through these difficulties. There were reports of reductions of up to 50% for child protection and mental health services in some areas in the early stages of this pandemic, because it is teachers that so often pick up on these problems and then make referrals to children's services. So with lots of children at home rather than in school, this hasn't been happening. And that, I think, is a genuine worry for a lot of us who are interested in these issues. And of course, I want to work constructively with the government, despite being an opposition MP. And I do pay tribute to the government for keeping schools and other educational settings open for vulnerable children throughout this pandemic. But my worry is that, unfortunately, very few vulnerable children for whom school can be a very safe haven were in attendance, particularly in the early weeks of the lockdown. So while many would, of course, have been safer and better off at home, there was also those who fell through the cracks because they weren't at school and teachers weren't picking up on the issues. That's some of the things that I've been very concerned about, hearing of reports of the casework that I deal with as a constituency MP. What I want to focus on is that we're approaching a potentially dangerous moment when all children return to school in September if schools and children's services aren't resourced to cope with the likely surge in demand. It's something that we've got to be aware of. A rise in child poverty, a decline in the well-being of children and young people, it can't be accepted as collateral damage of this crisis and the economic downturn. And it's our duty, all of us on this Zoom, politicians from all different colours, to come together and make sure that doesn't happen. So I guess the question is, what do we need to do? Firstly, I want to say that, of course, I fully support the aims of the Recovery Coalition. We must put children at the heart of our recovery from coronavirus. And there must, of course, be a recovery strategy for children that encompasses all relevant government departments. So there's working between different governments and working closely with those who are delivering services on the ground. And of course, listening to children themselves, as we've done on this meeting already. I think there's a real need to gather better data on well-being centrally so that we can understand specifically what children are going through. We need to look very closely at how coronavirus has entrenched existing inequalities. So, for example, it's not a secret, we always knew that children from BME backgrounds and young people are more likely to be young carers and now are more likely to have suffered bereavement. We've heard from the young people this morning that the isolation from friends and family have been a key issue. So I think we need to speed up the rollout of devices and support those in digital poverty. And I feel like this kind of information has to directly feed into the planning of services. I've said this before and I'll say it again. It can't be a bunch of us politicians sitting together in dark rooms in the Palace of Westminster making decisions. If we don't speak to people on the ground, then we won't get this right. And I want to speak a bit about how we potentially face a crisis point in the autumn as problems that have been developed or exacerbated by lockdown are identified. If we don't take the opportunity to make sure we're prepared, given that we already know what the shape of the problems are, that we have to make sure that we have a planned, resourced and coordinated effort to meet the needs of children when they return to school. And I do welcome the fact that the COVID catch-up funding can be used to support welfare, but the support and direction given to teachers must not be all crouched in academic terms. Well-being is really important for learning and has been set back significantly in recent months. And that's been made clear by all the young people who've spoken together today. So that must be a priority too. I also think we need a better understanding from the government of how this catch-up pot or other support that's been offered by the government can be used to deal with, say, mental health issues in school, which is one of the things that I think it was Dimitris who mentioned it when I asked the question. So what I would say is that short-term problem solving won't be enough to make sure that this crisis doesn't do avoidable long-term damage to children's well-being. As I said, I do agree with the Recovery Coalition that there must be a comprehensive long-term funding settlement to invest in children and young people's futures. I think it's a key test of the government's levelling up agenda, and we can't afford for them to fail. And the reality, I suppose I would say, is that it's not just this pandemic. Even before the pandemic, there were lots of children who weren't getting their needs met, and the sheer scale of the challenge that they now face is forcing all of us to look again at how we deliver and fund services. I am very much hoping that the government will look at the suggestions from the Recovery Coalition in the planned autumn budget, and that it will feed into the promised review of the care system. And this must be holistic, must look at prevention rather than just services for those in care. And I'd love to welcome a commitment from the Minister, just being cheeky here, about a date for this and a pledge to involve charities and children directly. The very comprehensive report that was authored by Barnardo's The Children's Society and other children's charities at the end of May, which I really recommend to everyone on this Zoom, really shone a spotlight on what happened to children's services over the last decade and what needs to change to meet the expected rise in demand. And finally, you'll be pleased to know, Tim, I am wrapping up. I just wanted to touch on the importance of local authorities. I was a councillor in Camden in London, and before I became an MP, I was in the cabinet of the council and I managed a budget. And so I am very aware of the cuts to local authority budgets in the last decades because I had to deal with them myself. This resulted in a £2 billion being taken out of children's services, and it really impaired the ability of councils and the services they commission to provide the support that they desperately want to be able to provide. So of course I welcome the money that the government has provided to councils in this crisis, but these gaps has to be plugged as a start before we start dealing with it. What I'm worried about is the salami slicing of services over many years has inevitably led to a focus on crisis management rather than early intervention and preventative measures that could stop problems ending up at crisis points. So I think I'll finish there, but just to say the pandemic must be a wake-up call that we can't go back to the gradual whittling away of children's services and other means of support. I think this is something we all agree on, and we have to work together in the coming months to develop a long-term recovery plan for children and young people so that they're not scarred by the experience of coronavirus.
Judith, thank you very much for that. Again, you packed an awful lot into that, and there's a lot of consensus on things we can agree on. But I think you're absolutely right to flag up that September is going to be a crucial time where all these various things that have been beneath the surface, off the radar, whilst children haven't been at school and families have been divorced from their social support networks and family networks and everything, are all going to come together in September, and it's absolutely essential that we are in a position to deal with that. Tulip, thank you very much indeed. We are going to move on now to the final grouping. I'm delighted we've got some representatives for witnesses from government departments and outside bodies, from education and the NHS, and they have, not surprisingly, been incredibly busy over the last few months. So I think I would just like to thank them on behalf of the all-party group for the immense amount of work that everybody within the NHS and within education have been doing, looking after our children and vulnerable families in particular, and it's greatly appreciated. We know what a lot of sacrifices many people have made. So first up, and thank you for extending your time with us, Professor. We have Professor Viv Bennett, CB, who is the Chief Nurse and Director of Maternity and Early Years at Public Health England, who's going to talk about the working plans of PHE to support the recovery. Professor, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you for the young people. What I would like to say is, so much of the work that I'm going to present to you in the next 5 or 6 minutes has been informed through the Children and Young People's Transformation Board, which contains government departments, the NHS, etc., and most importantly is co-chaired by young people, and by the reference group to that board, which includes a number of the charities who are on this call today. One of the things that we have, you talked, Tim, about positives of this, and there being some, and I think that the 3 speakers in this section would all say one of the positives that has come out of this has been our enhanced working together. Because of all the issues we know about the impact of COVID on children being indirect rather than direct, it's been really important to have a coalition around those indirect impacts at various levels for children and how we might manage them now and going forward. What became very clear was if you're going to work together in different ways, you need to have a common language, and we didn't have common language around vulnerability. We were meaning different things. So what we've done is to work together and with others to develop a framework of vulnerability, which allows us to model our work going forward picks up some of the points about data that have been mentioned. And I think each of us in turn is going to touch on one level of that framework. So broadly, the NHS and its initial conversations about vulnerability meant children who were clinically vulnerable, not just clinically vulnerable from the direct impacts of the virus, but from the indirects, including in mental health. For education, the issues around vulnerability, higher risk who have statutory entitlement, either in social work or special educational needs. And for public health, this was about vulnerability due to the wider determinants of health and other factors impacting on children, excuse me, who may be known or unknown to services. And we've been working to develop that framework. We've had very strong support from a number of voluntary sector bodies who found a common language to be very important as we move forward. So I'm going to just make a few points about the level that's due to higher risk because of the wider determinants of health. And within that group of families and within the work that needs to go forward are many of the things that have been mentioned: work, income, housing, troubled families, known or unknown, young carers, particular concern for all of us. We have some work jointly and separately planned for going forward over the next few months. In August or September, depending on publication date, PHE will be publishing a piece of work on vulnerability and adversity in childhood. And to pick up the last speaker's point, this didn't start with COVID. This has been, for many children, accelerated by COVID. So it's very important that we understand that. And in terms of the data point, this will be accompanied by a narrative on vulnerability, which can then be populated by each individual local authority by information that's currently available on PHE Fingertips platform. Place-based approaches to this are going to be vital, and having that information that allows each local authority to have a strong understanding and being able to quantify their children and families in vulnerable situations, and to some local authorities have already expressed an interest in using this framework to make sure that all those categories of children are supported, we think will be very helpful. For Public Health England, Best Start in Life has been and will continue to be one of our top 10 strategic priorities. We all know that what happens to you as early as pregnancy, actually, or probably even before, right through early childhood and the school years, impacts on your life chances throughout your adult life. And it's very important that we refocus that work around levelling up, around making sure that we close the gap in terms of school readiness, children being able to thrive through their education, and that we refocus that work strongly through a vulnerabilities lens, as I've just described. Public Health England is in the process of modernising the Healthy Child programme, working closely with the Department of Health and Social Care and the Department for Education. We think this is a vital step in the next steps to improving health outcomes for all of our children and young people and having no child left behind. We will be modernising the specific interventions, if you like, so checks and development reviews and screening processes and immunisations, but also, as or more importantly, trying to bring the best evidence on early intervention and support for the growing years into the programme going forward. In order to deliver that programme, it is really important that we have the appropriate workforce, and people have spoken to this subject already. Healthy Child programme is led and largely provided by health visitors and their teams and school nurses and their teams. Minister Ford said that she was very pleased to see that most health visitors were now back from being redeployed to the acute sector to manage the adult services that needed to be provided during the peak of the pandemic. And as the Chief Health Officer, I am, of course, very delighted to see that's happened, and almost all of that repatriation is complete now. The reason I have to leave, in fact, is to present at a webinar to health officers with the Institute of Health Visiting on how to have the most impact the soonest on children that have been negatively impacted. So, taking that forward.
Viv, you seem to have frozen. Have we lost Professor Viv? I think we have. Viv, I'm afraid you have a frozen face and we can't hear anything on the screen. I think you are coming to the end of your presentation, so I'm sorry, you're the first witness we've lost. We have lost her. Okay, can we go on to our second witness? So we've got Professor Simon Kenny, who's the National Clinical Director for Children and Young People in NHS England and Improvement. Simon, if you knew what Viv was going to end up with, you might want to fill in. Otherwise, over to you. The floor's yours.
Hi, hopefully I won't be frozen. I think Viv was just going to express her pleasure for having the health visitors back on the ground. Yeah. And to say that they're going to play an integral part in the recovery programme. Many thanks for inviting me, and I think I'd just like to say that integration is at the key of solving this, and having a combined health, education and social care discussion about these things is something that's happening on a regular basis between NHS England and other organisations, but it's absolutely the key. And it was in our long-term plan to do this, and so we've been able to pivot our plans to respond to COVID. It has been a busy few months though, and in January we were effectively facing an unknown disease, and we didn't know what the direct impacts were going to be on children. And so a lot of NHS England's response has been necessarily reactive, but I'd like to assure you that right from the start we were also looking at the strategic plans and trying to anticipate what problems might occur down the road. We do have a lot of families, and I know, speaking to my patients and parents, the reluctance to let their children go back to school is a really big problem. And I cannot emphasize the fact that fortunately COVID does not have a huge impact on children overall, although obviously individual impacts can be high. To put it in context of the 10 million children we have in the country, 1,200 required hospital admission during the first 3 months of the pandemic. And although we were prepared for a surge in intensive care, it was only 72 children that required paediatric intensive care units. And so in many ways, we've been through quite a quiet period in terms of critical paediatric illness. Sitting in that though was a group of children who developed the hyperinflammatory state. This was recognised first in the UK. People have asked why. I think it's because we've got a joined up healthcare system that enabled us to recognise patterns that weren't visible because the signal was quite low. And so we've doing urgent work with Public Health England to try and understand the epidemiology of which children are prone to getting that. And there are some signals such as Black and Asian minorities that are affected. And so we're urgently looking at that to try and understand and mitigate the effects of that. And also we're modifying the recovery trial for children to respond to research questions that this has raised. Right at the start, NHS England wrote out to around 90,000 children and their families to say that they needed to shield, because at that time there was a vacuum of evidence about who could potentially be infected and affected. And we've been able to work on our data sets and have started to hone down really which children are vulnerable. And the groups are very small. And I'm pleased to report that out of those 90,000, in the next few weeks, 85,000 children and families will be able to be removed from that shielding list. I think one of the issues we've got is actually persuading families that things are safe and with regards to their children. And in particular, We need to understand the impact within schools and on, as we've heard already, families where there's mixed generational ages living together, and we need to keep a close eye on those things. Going on to the indirect impacts of COVID, and we've heard a lot about the issues. I'll talk about a couple of things that we're dealing with at the moment. In that first month, we saw a 400% increase in 111 calls as GP services were reduced and access to A&E was reduced. And about a quarter of those calls were about children. And we saw a 2/3 reduction in A&E attendances and a 60% reduction in emergency admissions. So some quite profound changes took place in children's health services over this time. And so we were greatly concerned about whether there was delays in presentation and whether the stay at home to save lives message was impacting, and parents were reluctant to bring their children to hospital. And there was some initial signals that was happening from the surveillance we were taking place. So in response to that, we've changed NHS web page messaging. We've restructured NHS 111 pathways so that children are directed around a specific pathway, which is more likely to bring them into hospital and acute care. And the message was that the NHS was there for children and families. And since we've done that, we've been able to sort of see that concern about delayed presentations has more or less gone away, but we're not complacent. And we've also been able to trial paediatricians in 111 so that when parents phone for advice, they've got expert advice available. And we're analysing whether that's going to make a big difference, and we can use it in autumn when winter comes and pressures on children's health services gets worse. And we've also accelerated the development of a system-wide digital early warning system to detect deterioration in children at home. So we're working very hard on that group of children and realising also, because we've pivoted from an A&E based system to a more devolved system, that we need to change our systems and track what the effects of that has been. There's been quite a lot of discussion about mental health during the last hour or so, and we have been very mindful of this and been monitoring signals for children's mental health, and have provided, as has been alluded to by the Minister before, there's now 24-hour helplines available by mental health providers. But also we've been talking to those mental health providers and requesting that they reach out to children who are under existing care with them, and emphasising the need for elevated vigilance about possible signals that children's mental health may be under stress. And broadly speaking, we think that that's working. We've seen a reduction in referrals, but that may be due to the fact that schools aren't in play and the normal referral pathways aren't there. And we're very mindful of the fact that when September comes, we may see a different picture. With regards to elective programme of care, in the first 3 months, we saw 1.8 million cancelled outpatient appointments and 50,000 operations in surgery. And so we've got a big catch up to do. And also we need to be constantly vigilant for where risks are emerging. And there's been a big switch, like has been discussed with schools, there's been a big switch to virtual consultations and video consultations. And they've got advantages. They're potentially cheaper. The average cost for a family coming for an outpatient appointment is £30. And it can be easier for families with multiple commitments. And the carbon footprint is reduced as well. And I would notice from personal experience, the car park is less full in the hospital as well. The risks there are of digital poverty and inequity of access to digital equipment, and also in affording data for have video calls. And so all those are things that we are evaluating and looking at to make sure that we're not seeing those inequities developed as virtual consultations spread. There's also safeguarding issues that we have to pay attention to. And children and young people have expressed concerns that the dynamics of virtual consultations are quite different from what happens in hospital clinics, particularly I found over the telephone. With regards to surgery, we've spoken to children and young people, and the anxieties they have is about being a burden on the NHS at a time of great stress. And I'd like to emphasise that they're not, and we are there for them. They're also anxious about getting COVID or a family member getting COVID, and we take huge measures in terms of infection control to try and prevent that. And we've designed specific pathways and information leaflets to support children and young people and hopefully reassure them about those things. And also there's concern about how many parents and visitors can come and visit them whilst they're in hospital, and the lack of play facilities. And I have to say that with infection control being our primary aim, those play facilities do need focusing on, and how we're going to do that, because we want it to not be a bad experience. Fortunately, we've had 10 surgical operational delivery networks for surgery in children were developed in the last year. They were just coming into play when the pandemic struck, but they are going to be playing an important role in coordinating care and making sure that there is no inequity of access. So they are spread right across the country, and they should be able to allow us to see that there's a population level response, so that with that 50,000 children that we haven't operated on and children that we do need to operate on, the children who need care most will get it. And in particular, children from deprived and vulnerable backgrounds. And we'll be designing data sets to let us monitor that. But a really good example is in North Thames, where they've developed the operational delivery network's been going a bit longer than the other ones. They've devised a unified waiting list across the North Thames region between providers and clinician passports, so that surgeons and anaesthetists can move between hospitals to deliver care wherever the resources become available for them to do it. And they've also been working and contracting with the independent sector to increase operating capacity, because we've got a big job on our hands in the course of the next year or two to get back on track with regards to children's surgery. Last thing I'd like to mention is safeguarding issues. We've heard this discussion, and healthcare is often the first point of contact for safeguarding issues. And we are on alert to this. What is quite reassuring in the data is we haven't seen nationally a huge incidence in non-accidental injuries, but there is evidence of increased activity with phone calls to helplines and anecdotal evidence of increased disclosure of potential safeguarding issues. And I'm sure that we're all aware of what might be happening behind closed doors. We'll probably find more out in September as schools start to reopen. Yeah. So that was a quick run across things. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you very much. And I think your last point about some nasties coming out of the cupboard in September is very true. And your first point that you opened on, a positive point, and certainly it's been my experience in my neck of the woods in Sussex, how if there's one upside of this crisis, how the joint working and bringing closer together various parts of the health service and social care and education as well has been a real positive. And it's a question of how we take that back into peacetime as well, to use the advantages of how we've had to work much better together during this crisis. Thank you. Now, our last witness who has been waiting very patiently as part of this panel is Indra Morris, who's the Director General of Social Care, Mobility and Disadvantage at the Department for Education. So, Indra, over to you, and then we'll have a few questions in the limited time we've got left at the end.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. And thank you. And I've been reflecting on what I've been hearing and the work we've been doing in the light of the principles that we've also touched on during this discussion. But before I do, I was struck by what you said at the opening about children and young people not really being on the radar. And I think it's really important to say that right from the outset, vulnerable children and young people were a key and a formal priority. So government had some kind of a number of top priority programs, and vulnerable children and young people was probably the only one that wasn't sort of directly COVID related in a sort of clinical sense. So even if it wasn't grabbing the headlines, it was absolutely front and center. And I think that's reflected in the decision to keep schools and settings open for both key worker children and vulnerable children and young people. So I think that's really important. I think one of the really important challenges and messages in the video and what we heard at the beginning links to the principle of understanding how needs have changed and and then acting on that and taking that into recovery. And thanks to Dimitri and others. And I, take very seriously what you said about not feeling heard. And I was reflecting, we've done a lot with charities, with some of whom are here today, and organisations like the Disabled Children's Partnership and so forth. And Minister Ford earlier touched on some of the conversations that she's had and the session she's got, I think, with Bernardo's next week. But I was actually also reflecting that quite a lot of the conversations I've had have actually been in the main probably with parents, professionals and charities. So actually one of the things that would be useful to do, and maybe working with NCB, is have a sort of follow-up conversation that's unfiltered with some of the children and young people we've heard from, and bring in some of my colleagues from across government as well at official level. I think that would be incredibly helpful. One of the other most important principles, I think, that we need to remember going into recovery is this challenge to be integrated and holistic in our approach. And you just talked, didn't you, about maintaining that joint working in peacetime, which I think is really one of the kind of absolute challenges and things that I sort of, will try and stay true to. So I'm here as a sort of DFE DG, Director General, but my focus was deliberately wider. And so our work throughout the crisis, and I think, again, we need to sustain this going into recovery, is to work with other government departments, with local authorities, with police around concern about hidden harms, with health colleagues, with charities, alongside all my colleagues on early years and schools and further education in the department. It's a much wider focus, and a huge thanks to Viv, I know has had to leave, but she's been absolutely pivotal in this, in bringing health to the table and helping us have a shared language and approach for thinking about children and young people and the sort of response. And the that sort of holistic approach has been reflected in how we thought about our crisis response and the elements that we need to focus on, and that we need to then build on going into recovery. So right at the beginning, we focused on attendance at schools and early years, and safeguarding. And actually very early on, partly through discussions and listening to experiences and the messages about the impact and the effect of this lockdown and the wider context on children and young people, was to say, actually, that's too narrow. We need to think, as well as on attendance and safeguarding, we need to think about well-being, and that includes mental health, that includes food. We need to have attainment and some of the challenges that Rob Halfon talked about earlier, and that's education, but it's also sort of skills. So again, I think going into recovery, maintaining that sort of holistic approach and that broad focus is going to be really, really important. And there are a number of things I think that, and I don't want to repeat what Minister Ford says, so I'll just draw out on a few things that we started, if you like, in the crisis response, but think that it's really important that we build on in recovery. And we've talked already, I mean, the first of these, and we've touched on this quite a lot, is attendance at early years at schools, at colleges, and thinking ahead to September. We know being in school in early years and colleges is a protective factor, not just from a safeguarding perspective, but from a well-being. The messages we're hearing about feeling disconnected and feeling alone and feeling uncertain about the future. And we've had we set up a very rapid a team within the department to work with local authorities and schools to understand actually what was happening on the ground, how many children were there, how many children we should be worrying about because they weren't in school, and how many children with social workers were actually, had contact with their social worker. And thinking ahead to September, actually we need to think about building confidence, and we've touched on this, haven't we, about confidence that it's safe to go back to school, that transport's available, and so forth. And I think that's going to be incredibly important. But On the point about children's referrals to children's services, we've been keeping a very strong eye on that with local government and directors of children's services, and the drop of referrals that was mentioned earlier. If you talk to local government, it wasn't as significant as they feared, and is beginning to drop again. But that is pick up again. So that's something that we're sort of keeping an eye on, and that's why I think we're going to need to continue as we go into recovery, focusing on what we've called hidden harms. And it links to the point that was made about schools being one of the most significant referrers to children's services, although police actually are the biggest referral overall. So that's why the expansion of the NSPCC helpline was really important, why the funding of Bernardo's See Hear Respond was really important, but also why the focus on babies and under ones was really important, because they don't have a voice. And so the work with health on that about and the Home Office to both on health visitors, but also restarting birth registrations, which we were really concerned about from a safeguarding perspective. So, you know, thinking about those things and building on that as we go, as we come out of the sort of emergency response and into recovery. But I think continuing to listen and learn, because let's face it, there are still, I think, quite a lot of unanswered questions about the extent of impact, and indeed some of the positives, which I've heard, particularly from some SEND children and young people and families, about positive experience of having some time at home and away from some stressful situations. So we've got to kind of continue to sort of listen and learn, and also think about where there are, and again, we've heard this, a number of things touched on today about young carers, about care leavers and others. So I think continuing to think not just about how the universal offers around things like catch-up provision in schools can be tailored to meet different needs, but actually where is there a need for targeted provision and targeted support to meet different needs. And that's already, some of that is already in hand. So for example, for alternative provision, those year 11 children and young people where the risk of becoming needy is greater, already putting in some sort of targeted support. Think, you know, providing flexibilities in the adoption of support under families who are under stress to give them support during difficult times, support to care leavers, so including them in the digital provision, the laptop provision, but also additional funding for personal advisors to provide support and so forth. So, you know, that's just a few things, but I think it's really, really important to say that one of the things I've been really struck by is that schools and social workers in particular and health professionals are not sort of sitting by waiting for sort of formal referrals. There's been some really creative thinking about how do they reach children who may not be more visible because they're not turning up at school for different reasons, or they may not be known. You know, they may not be known, but teachers know, families, you know, good teachers, good schools know. Social workers have been thinking about, okay, who did we work with 6 months ago who we decided didn't really need support, this formal support this time, but let's just check in with them. Let's just check in with our care leavers. Let's ask our care leavers to buddy others. You know, there's some really brilliant, innovative local practice where recognizing that there's a lot of imperfections and a lot of challenges, but just not sitting by and waiting for it to sort of formally come to the surface, but going out there and looking for people who need support. So I think if I stop there, I hope that gives you a flavour.
Indra, thank you very much. I'm aware that we've only got a few more minutes left. Your suggestion about facilitating a discussion between officials and young people, I've had lots of comments about yes, please. So that will be taken up readily. And also your point about really young children. A point I raised in the Commons the other day, during lockdown, something like 200,000 babies have been born at a time when the pressures on perinatal mental illness are that much greater. The access to extended family support networks that a new mum would normally get are not there. The access to health visitors just not there as normal. And we absolutely need to remember the preschool age kids, because if we don't deal with that now, then when they get to school, we're really going to see those problems come through. Now, I'm just going to take a couple more questions. Baroness Walmsley wanted to ask a question, and then I did say I'll come back to Kimberlyn and Sylvie. I don't know if Kimberlyn, you asked your question of the Minister anyway, but I'll take them all together. So Joan Walmsley first.
Tim, thank you. It was a question for Viv Bennett, and I followed up your suggestion and sent her a chat question directly, so I can opt out now.
Very efficient. Thank you very much, Baroness. Sylvie or Kimberlyn, did you want to raise a point?
Hi there. So thanks.
Kimberlyn, yeah.
Thanks for answering. Well, the Minister had answered the question quite briefly for us. But just to reiterate how important it is for the early year settings to be supported by government as well. For my 3-year-old, I didn't find that there was a lot of support with regards to her doing any kind of curriculum. I know they're only 3, but they do have things that they get done during the term. That was not supported throughout the whole lockdown period. If it wasn't through my own initiative, my daughter wouldn't have been able to, well, not be doing much to do with any kind of nursery setting work. So it's something that I think nurseries need to be accountable at some stage of what support they give to parents, because not all parents are going to have the initiative. Maybe their first language is not English. So it's going to be an issue. It's going to be a barrier. And this is where I think earlier settings need to really be on point. I know LEAP does so much in our community in Lambeth, and we're ever so grateful for them as volunteers. But there's a lot more people suffering throughout the whole of the UK. And I'm sure there are ways the government could implement more support for these nursery settings. Thank you.
Kimberlyn, thank you for that. I'm going to end on that question, and it's a really important point as well, because we are the all-party group for children, and that goes, well, as far as I'm concerned, it goes from conception right up to 18. And we've spoken a lot about the pressures on schools and kids going back to school and everything as well, but there's big pressure too on those new mums, on the parents with preschool age children, with the lack of childcare that's been there during lockdown as well, and all those pressures. It's really important that all those different considerations form part of the recovery program that we need to be putting together. Look, we've had a pretty intensive 2 hours, and with the exception of losing the final minute or so of Viv, amazingly, the technology has all gone incredibly well. So I'm really grateful to our friends at NCB for making all this happen, and for all our speakers, because we've covered a huge range of issues. Really particular thanks to Demetrius, Alicia and Disha for their contributions, and particularly in that video, which I think really very powerfully put across all those sorts of considerations, some of which have not been on the main priority list. You know, the bereavement, the job loss, and the impact on families and children of people who are going to be losing their job through coronavirus, the impact on carers, particularly new carers who become carers during the pandemic, the impact on children doing exams, the extended family support that hasn't necessarily been there. There's a whole load of considerations, which is why it absolutely needs a joint response from all departments of government, but working closely with the voluntary sector, the charity sector, the children's sector generally, and absolutely at the heart of that needs to be the voice of children and young people themselves. And so I hope, and some of the comments I see have come back, some of the younger people we've had on this webinar have appreciated, you know, you've been talking to some of the top people who make the decisions in government, in the NHS, in education as well, have heard your voice. So I think there's lots to take away from this. I just urge everybody to take away one thing in particular that you've really got out of today, and to focus on that, to bang on about it. Anybody you come across in positions of responsibility, keep making that case. We'll publish some notes from this this meeting. The live stream, I presume, has been recorded, so people can dip in and out of it and refer back to it. Sam's put some of the notes and research as well. We'll make sure those are all available on the various websites. But it is now 4 o'clock. Can I thank everybody for making this a real success? but we've all really got to keep on the case here, because as Tulip said, September is going to be absolutely crucial, and a lot of these different considerations and weaknesses and problems going on under the radar, behind the scenes, behind locked doors as well, could well come out. We need to be, all of us, vigilant as to how we're going to best deal with that. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. Thank you very much, particularly to all our witnesses. And we will see you back in the new term, probably still virtually, but the next all-party meeting will be sometime in the autumn, and it would be great to catch up on how far the progress we've made after this. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Tim.
Huge thank you to you, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
And to you, Anna, and the team as well. Thank you.